Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I've been doing this thing where I read a classic novel, either a classic that I read in middle school, high school, or college but want to revisit, or one that's completely new to me, and then I talk a little bit about it. The one that I did this month was The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo. My familiarity with Victor Hugo's work comes mostly from the novel Les Miserables, its musical and movie adaptations, and a couple of poems of his that I've read. Before recently, I had actually never read The Hunchback of Notre Dame and never seen any adaptations of it, including the animated Disney one. I did watch a lot of Disney movies when I was a child, but somehow I never ended up watching that particular one. Which, honestly, I'm kind of grateful for, because I think that if I had read the book having seen the Disney movie, I would have been extremely disappointed. I did go back and watch the Disney movie actually on Disney Plus after I finished reading the book, and it was very different. Very different from the book. There were some things that I was surprised by that they kept in the movie, like just Frollo's motivation being lust for Esmeralda. Like, I wouldn't have expected that to be in a child-friendly, G-rated animated movie. But large parts of the plot, the characters' personalities, and the entire way that the story ends are just completely different in the Disney movie than they are in the novel. So I'm glad that I was able to go into the novel without those preconceived ideas about what I should expect to see happen. The Hunchback of Notre Dame was one of Victor Hugo's earlier works. It was actually written several decades before Les Miserables and was published originally in 1831. The French title is Notre Dame de Paris, which is what the Notre Dame Cathedral is called in French. Literally, it means Our Lady of Paris. It's translated as The Hunchback of Notre Dame in English, but actually I think that Notre Dame de Paris is a better title for it. The cathedral itself is far more of a focal point in the story than any one character, including Quasimodo, who's the so-called Hunchback of Notre Dame. In fact, there are sections of the novel that focus more on architecture and describing the cathedral itself and the ways in which it has changed over time, and the author's disapproval of some of the changes that were made, particularly in recent years, and doesn't really have anything to do with the actual plot, but is just kind of the author's thoughts. There's this whole section on architecture and how the book will destroy the building or something along those lines. I don't remember the exact wording at this moment, but in a time when written manuscripts were incredibly valuable and rare because the printing press hadn't been invented, and in which most people couldn't read and write to begin with, architecture was used to tell a story in a sense. Those old cathedrals with their stained glass windows and their intricately carved sculptures, those were how information was conveyed in a sense. And so when the character of Claude Frollo expresses the idea of the book as taking the place of the building, it's not that books could serve the same basic function as the building. They're not going to be a roof over your head and walls to keep out the elements, but rather that books were becoming the primary way of conveying information and meaning. I find these little digressions to be an incredibly frustrating aspect of Victor Hugo's work, but not one that I'm unfamiliar with by any means. In fact, there were far fewer of them, and they were, I would say, in some cases, more closely related to the ultimate point of the novel than the ones in Les Miserables. Les Miserables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame actually have a lot of similarities, but they have several important differences as well. As far as differences go, The Hunchback of Notre Dame is historical fiction, whereas Les Miserables is really kind of borderline as to whether it would be considered historical fiction or not. I talked in a previous video about the difference between contemporary and historical fiction. Historical fiction is often defined in terms of when the events of the story take place in comparison to either the time when the book is written or the author's life experience. So, for instance, an author writing about events that they lived through themselves or that take place within a couple of decades of the time when they're writing usually wouldn't be considered historical fiction. But Les Miserables has a huge scope as far as time frame. There are chapters that take place everywhere from the 1810s to the 1830s, and that's not counting the early backstory stuff like Jean Valjean's childhood, for instance. Anyway, that's kind of a tangent, sorry about that. What I really wanted to talk about is the fact that While Les Miserables is probably not historical fiction, The Hunchback of Notre Dame definitely is. It takes place in the Middle Ages. So the society that's being portrayed in The Hunchback of Notre Dame is not one from the relatively recent past that the author experienced and lived through himself. It's one that comes from a long time ago. And in fact, sometimes he discusses the time that elapsed in between, the changes that happened between the time period when the novel is set and the time period in which he's living and writing about it. He does that in Les Miserables as well, but it's a much shorter time frame, and the changes are much less significant in most cases. Another huge difference between the two is that The Hunchback of Notre Dame takes place over a much shorter period of time. Whereas Les Miserables spans decades, The Hunchback of Notre Dame takes place within just a few weeks. It also has a much smaller cast of characters, although that doesn't mean that it's a small cast of characters, just smaller than Les Miserables. And as you might guess from it covering a shorter time period and having a smaller cast of characters, it's a much smaller book. For reference, here are my copies of the two. Anyway, I've talked a lot about what makes the two books different, but let's talk about what makes them similar. And that's mostly the thematic elements and the types of characters that Victor Hugo chose to focus on. In both Les Miserables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame, one of the author's main points of concern is justice versus injustice and ways in which the justice system of the time and place in which they are set is in many ways unfair and even cruel. This looks very different in the two books, but both Esmeralda and Jean Valjean suffer tremendously under a system of justice that pretty much takes their guilt for granted and treats them much more harshly than the crimes that they've committed, or not committed in Esmeralda's case, really deserve. Esmeralda is framed for murder, and then the guy who she supposedly murders turns out to be fine. Not only was she not the one who hurt him, but he survives his injury and then just spends the rest of the novel kind of walking around and doing stuff and not really caring that someone's been sentenced to death for his murder. And meanwhile, Esmeralda is tortured and forced into a false confession, which includes so many different things that she did not do whatsoever. Not just supposedly murdering Captain Phoebus, but also engaging in witchcraft and all kinds of stuff. And then in Les Miserables, Jean Valjean legitimately did commit a crime, but a very minor one. He stole a loaf of bread to feed his sister's starving children. That's not the sort of thing that most people would see as, like, a sign of being irredeemably evil or something, but from the moment that he steals the bread, his life is ruined. In addition, in both of these situations, there is a corrupt authority figure. Now, I kind of think that Claude Frollo is a much worse person than Inspector Javert, in that Javert is legitimately trying to enforce the law and makes no exceptions in any situation, including for himself. He insists on being completely by the book to the point of being cold and uncaring, but it's hard to imagine him abusing his authority in the way that Claude Frollo does. But it seems very clear that corruption and hypocrisy, or in the case of Inspector Javert, a very black and white legalistic view of things without any room for nuance or context, was something that he was very critical of in his work. Another thing that I noticed in comparing the two is that in both cases, the characters that Victor Hugo gravitated towards the most as protagonists were the ones who were mistreated or outcast in some way. I mean, you see it in the title of Les Mis. It's Les Miserables, the wretched, it's sometimes translated as. And that's totally the case in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, too. Both Esmeralda and Quasimodo, who are definitely the most heroic characters in the book. Esmeralda because of her ethnicity and Quasimodo because of his physical deformity, are treated like total pariahs by society and particularly by those in power. That doesn't really surprise me, just kind of a point of interest. One thing that I did not like about The Hunchback of Notre Dame was that it took a long time to get going and kind of meandered for a good portion of the story. Once it really gets going with the whole thing with Esmeralda being falsely accused of murder and claiming sanctuary in the Notre Dame Cathedral and all of that, then it gets interesting. But the early part, I did feel like took a while to even kind of see, like, okay, where is the plot? Where is this going? And I do tend to like stories that get going a little bit more quickly. That's definitely something that I would have expected in a work coming from Victor Hugo because, like, Les Miserables takes about 60 pages just to introduce the main character, so it definitely wasn't unexpected, but it also wasn't something that I was all that thrilled with. Like I said earlier, I did watch the Disney movie after I finished reading the book. I'm really glad that I waited and did not watch the Disney movie first, even like now as an adult, because I feel like the book has a lot more to it than the Disney movie. I'm actually really kind of confused as to why it would have been selected to adapt into a Disney movie, just because nothing about it seems at all appropriate for that. It doesn't really have any commonalities with other Disney movies of that era. And the story is one where they had to change it almost completely in order to make it work at all. And still, it makes for an incredibly dark and disturbing movie, which I'm astonished managed to get a G rating. I just have to wonder, like, what was it that made somebody at Disney decide, like, oh, this right here is what we need to make a movie out of? Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you liked it and you want to see more from me, be sure to subscribe. I post new videos every Monday and Thursday.